Somewhere inside Microsoft's Redmond headquarters, there's a number that nobody wants to say out loud in public. It's not a stock price. It's not a quarterly earnings figure. It's something quieter and far more dangerous. A slow, steady migration of trust, moving away from Windows, away from Microsoft's entire ecosystem, in places you were never told to look. Not in a press conference, not in a product launch, in government ministries, in military procurement offices, in the fine print of laptop checkout pages. And once you see the pattern, you start to understand something unsettling. The headline, asking whether the world's biggest PC makers just quit Windows, isn't even asking the right question. The real question is why in 2026, the most powerful institutions on Earth have quietly started building an exit door, and why Microsoft can see them walking toward it and still can't stop them. Here's where most explanations of this story go wrong. They tell you that one PC maker, somewhere, suddenly woke up one morning and decided to abandon Windows entirely. That's the clean, viral version. It's also not quite what happened. What actually happened is smaller on the surface and much bigger underneath. Lenovo has been shipping laptops with Linux distributions like Fedora and Ubuntu pre-installed at a lower price than the same models running Windows, in markets including the United States and Canada. And according to people who've tracked this closely, this practice has quietly existed since at least 2020. Dell does something similar through its Ubuntu certified lineup. Asus has its own Linux compatibility ecosystem running in parallel to its Windows machines. None of that, on its own, is a headline. But here's where it gets worse. Because the reason that small, years-old pricing quirk suddenly exploded into a viral storyline in 2026 isn't really about Lenovo at all. It's about timing. It surfaced at the exact moment the entire foundation underneath Windows started cracking in public, and that's the part nobody's slowing down to explain. It's faucets, fauces. Think about what was happening in the background while that headline spread. Support for Windows 10 officially ended on October 14th, 2025, which sounds like a routine corporate milestone until you understand what it actually triggered. Hundreds of millions of working computers, some of them only a few years old, were suddenly informed they were no longer eligible for free security updates. Not because they stopped working, but because Microsoft decided they weren't allowed to run the next operating system. And this is where you have to read between the lines of the corporate language. 3 out of 10 HP customers, by the company's own admission, still hadn't upgraded to Windows 11 as the deadline approached, and close to half of all PC installations worldwide were still running Windows 10 just over a month before support ended completely, according to the PC makers themselves. Read that again. Half. Not a fringe group of holdouts clinging to old habits. Half of the operating systems running the modern global economy were sitting on a platform about to lose every future patch, every future fix, every future layer of protection. Microsoft plus 2. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. This wasn't really a hardware failure. It was a designed obsolescence event. Critics and consumer advocacy groups have openly accused Microsoft of programmed obsolescence, arguing that the stringent hardware requirements for Windows 11 effectively forced millions of perfectly functional machines into early retirement. And the public interest research group warned this would deepen the digital divide for people who simply couldn't afford to replace working equipment. Somewhere in a corporate strategy document, a calculation was made. It is more profitable to make people buy new machines than to let old ones keep running safely. That calculation is not a conspiracy theory. It's a business decision visible in the requirements list. And it's the first crack in the story. The first moment ordinary users, IT departments, and procurement officers started asking a question they'd never seriously asked before. What happens if we just don't follow Microsoft's roadmap this time? Windows Central. For consumers, that question led somewhere relatively quiet. A slow trickle toward Linux Mint, toward dual boot setups, toward what enthusiast communities now call de-Microsofting, swapping Edge for Firefox, Office for LibreOffice, one piece at a time, as a hedge against a future switch. But for governments, the question led somewhere far more consequential. And this is where everything changes, because what started as frustrated consumers grumbling about forced upgrades has metastasized into something that looks less like a tech trend and more like a geopolitical realignment. In April of 2026, France's Interministerial Digital Directorate, DINUM, the body that effectively runs the country's federal technology policy, issued a directive that technology analysts are now calling one of the most consequential open source decisions in the history of the European Union. Every French ministry and every affiliated public operator was ordered to submit a formal plan to eliminate dependency on non-European digital infrastructure by autumn 2026, covering operating systems, collaborative tools, antivirus software, AI platforms, databases, virtualization, and network equipment, with DINUM itself migrating its own workstations from Windows to Linux immediately. This is not a pilot program. This is not a study committee. France's Minister of Public Accounts, Daniel Amiel, announced the country's plan to switch 2.5 million government desktops to Linux and to abandon Microsoft entirely. Sit with that number for a second. 2.5 million machines. Every police department, every court, every tax office, every ministry, all moving in the same direction, on the same timeline, ordered from the top. Border Cyber Group TUTA. And France is not moving alone. It is, according to multiple analysts tracking this shift, simply the largest domino to fall so far. Germany's northernmost state, Schleswig-Holstein, has been called the European vanguard of this movement, migrating 30,000 government employees away from Microsoft's entire ecosystem, Office 365, Teams, Outlook, Exchange, toward LibreOffice, Thunderbird, and Linux, with roughly 80% of workstations completed by early 2026. The financial numbers behind that migration are not small. The state's digital transformation minister reported that Schleswig-Holstein would save more than 15 million euros in licensing costs in 2026 alone, against a one-time migration investment of 9 million euros, meaning the entire project paid for itself in under a year. Denmark didn't wait to watch how that experiment played out before acting on its own. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs announced its own switch from Microsoft to LibreOffice, with the country's digital minister stating plainly that Denmark must never make ourselves so dependent on so few that we can no longer act freely. Austria adopted a national charter on digital sovereignty. The Netherlands' capital published a strategy aiming for full digital autonomy by 2035. This is not a handful of disconnected pilot projects anymore. This is a continent quietly rehearsing what life without Microsoft actually looks like. Border Cyber Group +2. But here's where you have to ask the uncomfortable question nobody in the boardrooms once asked out loud. Why now? Why, after 3 decades of total Microsoft dependency across European public infrastructure, did this suddenly become urgent in 2026 instead of staying a fringe idea championed by open source idealists? The answer is not really about money, even though the savings numbers are real and significant. The answer is about something that happened that proved, in the most concrete way possible, exactly how exposed these institutions actually were. Here it is. After the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants connected to alleged war crimes, the Trump administration imposed sanctions on the ICC, and the court's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, reportedly found himself locked out of his own email accounts, a mechanism that was not hypothetical, but had been deployed against a sitting international judicial official on European soil with immediate operational consequences. Microsoft denied direct involvement and never fully explained how the disconnection occurred. But the message landed anyway, and it landed hard, in exactly the rooms where digital policy gets decided. The lesson European officials drew from that episode was blunt and impossible to unlearn. Any institution running its critical operations on American corporate software is, in effect, one executive order away from losing access to its own infrastructure. This is not chaos. This is strategy. A deliberate, top-down reassessment of risk that treats software dependency the same way a nation treats energy dependency or food security. And once you start seeing it that way, every migration announcement stops looking like an IT upgrade and starts looking like a sovereignty decision. Border Cyber Group. There's a legal mechanism sitting underneath all of this that almost nobody outside policy circles talks about, and it deserves more attention than it gets. Officials in both Germany and Denmark have repeatedly cited the U.S. Cloud Act, a law that requires American companies to grant U.S. authorities access to data stored abroad as fundamentally incompatible with their own principle of data sovereignty. Think about what that actually means in practice. A European government could store its citizens' most sensitive records, court files, medical data, tax records, police investigations, inside servers physically located within European borders, behind European privacy law, and a piece of U.S. legislation could still, in theory, reach across that border and compel disclosure. For decades, that was treated as an acceptable cost of doing business with the most powerful software companies on the planet. It no longer is. And this is where most people are not seeing the full picture. This entire movement is not actually a story about operating systems. It's a story about who controls the infrastructure that controls everything else, and a growing number of nations have decided they are no longer comfortable with the answer being someone else. Cyber news. Now widen the frame even further because the institutional world had already quietly answered this question for itself, long before governments caught up. According to detailed industry breakdowns circulating among IT professionals, market maker infrastructure at firms like Citadel Securities runs almost entirely on Linux. Morgan Stanley's enterprise compute grids for risk analysis run on Linux. Goldman Sachs built its core securities database platform on Linux. And Visa's transaction processing network relies on Linux mainframes because, according to those same sources, Windows simply cannot handle the mathematical load or reliability requirements at that scale. The pattern repeats everywhere you look once you start checking. CERN runs its Large Hadron Collider entirely on Linux because Windows cannot process the sheer volume of data involved. NASA switched the International Space Station's support computers from Windows to Linux, specifically for stability. SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Dragonflight computers run on Linux, and every single one of the world's top 500 supercomputers runs Linux. Windows holds 0% of that list. Zero. Not a small share. Zero. The institutions responsible for the most mathematically demanding, mission-critical, zero-tolerance for failure computing on the planet have already made their decision, and they made it a long time ago. IT Pro Expert. IT Pro Expert. And then came the moment that turned a quiet technical preference into a public, undeniable warning. In July of 2024, a flawed update from the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike, deployed across systems running Windows, crashed roughly 8.5 million Windows machines globally, freezing airlines, banks, and hospitals in a single coordinated failure. Flights grounded, emergency systems disrupted, financial transactions frozen mid-process. And in the middle of that chaos, one detail stood out to every chief information officer watching it unfold. Linux-based systems were largely unaffected by the outage. That single contrast, one operating system collapsing globally while its open-source counterpart kept running, did more to accelerate institutional distrust of Windows than a decade of pricing complaints ever could. It proved in real time in front of the entire world that Windows had become a single point of failure for systems the global economy actually depends on. Think about what that means for every boardroom risk assessment written since. IT Pro Expert. IT Pro Expert. So now layer the economics back on top of everything else, because this is the part that turns institutional unease into individual kitchen table frustration. The cost of building or upgrading a PC has become genuinely brutal. DRAM prices have surged 171% year over year, with DDR5 memory kits that cost around $100 in mid-2025, now approaching $200, while SSD prices climb steeply and GPU prices rise as manufacturers cut production and raise list prices, with no clear timeline for when any of it stabilizes. Layer onto that the tariff pressures pushing PC makers to raise prices further, and the Copilot Plus AI PC Premium that HP itself has acknowledged adds roughly 5 to 10% to the price of machines certified under Microsoft's new AI branding. And you get a hardware market where the cost of staying inside Microsoft's ecosystem keeps climbing at exactly the moment household budgets can least absorb it. This is the part that connects the government's sovereignty story directly back to ordinary people sitting at their kitchen tables, staring at a laptop that Microsoft has just declared obsolete, looking at the price of a replacement, and asking themselves a question they never expected to seriously consider. Is there another way to do this? Medium computer world. And the data says, increasingly, people are answering yes. Linux gaming usage on the Steam platform hit 5.33% in March 2026, driven by the Steam Deck, improved Proton compatibility layers, and the end of Windows 10 support pushing new users toward alternatives. Global Linux desktop market share reached 4.7% in 2025, with the United States crossing the 5% threshold for the first time in June of that year, while India leads major economies with adoption above 16%. None of those numbers, taken alone, sound dramatic. But here's the trajectory that should actually concern Microsoft's strategists. Every one of those percentage points represents millions of individual decisions made not because anyone forced the switch, but because, as one analyst tracking the movement put it, people finally had enough, and Linux finally became good enough. That combination, exhaustion meeting capability, is exactly the kind of slow-burning shift that doesn't show up clearly in a single quarter's earnings call and then suddenly shows up in all of them at once. Medium. Now here's where the power shift becomes impossible to ignore, because Microsoft is not blind to any of this, and its own behavior tells you how seriously it's taking the threat. Regulatory pressure is closing in from multiple directions simultaneously. European Commission antitrust scrutiny, a Competition and Markets Authority investigation in the UK, and a continent-wide Interoperable Europe Act that increasingly requires public sector institutions to seriously evaluate open-source alternatives before defaulting to proprietary lock-in. None of that pressure exists in a vacuum. It exists because the sovereignty movement gave regulators political cover they didn't have before, and because the institutional exodus gave them concrete proof that alternatives actually work at scale. Schleswig-Holstein's spreadsheet of savings is now a policy weapon in Brussels. The ICC email lockout is now a cautionary tale cited in parliamentary debates. The CrowdStrike outage is now a footnote in every enterprise risk assessment written since. Each piece feeds the next, and the cumulative effect is a slow erosion of the assumption that underpinned Microsoft's entire business model for 3 decades. The assumption that there simply was no credible alternative. But here is the part that the original viral headline gets fundamentally backwards, and it's worth being honest about it directly. Lenovo did not wake up one day and rip Windows out of its product line. Asus has not abandoned Windows for its mainstream laptops. There is, in fact, an entire counter-narrative circulating that directly challenges the more sensational claims, debunking the idea that any major PC maker has made Linux the default operating system or is charging a punitive premium for Windows. The dramatic framing oversells the individual headline while, ironically, undersells the actual scale of what's happening underneath it. The real story isn't that Lenovo quit Windows in some single dramatic press release. The real story is that the conditions that made Windows the unquestioned default for 30 years, cheap hardware, total market lock-in, no credible substitute, and an absence of geopolitical risk attached to software choice, have all simultaneously started to weaken at the same time in the same decade, for the first time since Windows became the default operating system of the modern world. YouTube? So what does that actually mean going forward, once you strip away the clickbait and look at what's left standing? It means PC makers are no longer treating Linux options as a niche afterthought buried in a filter menu. They are quietly preserving and expanding them as a hedge, a release valve, an insurance policy against a future where governments mandate alternatives and consumers demand them. It means Microsoft is fighting a war on three fronts simultaneously: regulatory pressure in Brussels and London, sovereignty-driven defections across European public infrastructure, and consumer-level economic exhaustion driven by hardware costs and forced obsolescence cycles. It means the institutions that already run on Linux, the banks, the space agencies, the supercomputers, are no longer isolated outliers but quiet proof of concept for everyone watching from the outside, wondering whether the switch is actually survivable. And it means that every new headline, however oversimplified, however clickbait-shaped, is functioning as a kind of pressure valve releasing a much larger, much slower, much more consequential shift that has been building underneath the surface for years. What happens next is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is the most honest place to leave this story. Does France's 2.5 million desktop migration actually complete on schedule, or does it stall the way Munich's celebrated open source experiment famously did 2 decades ago, only to quietly reverse years later? Does the rest of the European Union follow Germany and Denmark's lead, or do France and Schleswig-Holstein remain the loudest exceptions in a market that ultimately snaps back to Microsoft once the political moment passes? Does the United States, where this entire sovereignty conversation has barely begun, eventually face its own version of this reckoning? Or does the world's largest software market remain insulated from a movement that, for now, is overwhelmingly European? And if Microsoft's grip on global computing infrastructure really is loosening one government ministry, one supercomputer cluster, one frustrated consumer at a time, what does the next decade of the operating system wars actually look like? And who, exactly, is positioned to win it? Nobody currently sitting in Redmond, Paris, or Brussels can answer that with certainty, which might be exactly why this story is still unfolding in real time instead of already being written into the history books.